my career.
Sure, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
In terms of your education, I assume you did A-levels and you went to...
Yes. My subjects were English literature, history and economics.
And this was in preparation for law school?
Yes, indeed.
Where
So
did
that
you go
was...
for law school?
It was called Chelmer, which was actually Essex Institute of Higher Education. I'm sure it's probably called something different now, like Essex University. I've lost track of it, to be honest. But I enjoyed my A-levels. I suppose English literature and economics are quite a contrast. But again, that gave me, I think, quite a good combination of some arty subjects on the one hand, the English literature, but the rather more hard-nosed business of economics and, economics in terms of how it plays into politics, and my subsequent career working alongside politicians and working in an environment, of course, where money is very, very important in terms of the defence budget and the conflicting demands on the defence budget, particularly in time of recession.
In terms of education, what did you enjoy most, or what do you enjoy learning most?
Funnily enough, it was probably the history. Just fascinated by the past and some of the interplay. And again, it's all really about politics, isn't it? But again, one of the interesting things that I learnt in history was about the way in which religion and politics were inextricably linked, and how on occasion religion was the excuse, but power was what it was really all about.
Do you consider yourself religious?
No, not really. I would like to think, I suppose, that death's not the end. As to whether there's a God or not, or whether the human spirit, the consciousness, survives the death of the physical body, well, I don't know. I'll hope to be pleasantly surprised.
Good. And going back to your work at the MOD, tell us more about the details of your daily routine and what you did.
Well, I did that first job with the Navy for 2 years or so, I think, 2.5 years. And after that, I was promoted, and I did a rather interesting casework job where I was working this time with the Air Force. So on this occasion, I would be involved in, for example, cases where it was alleged that someone who had failed to be recruited into the Air Force had been discriminated against, perhaps in terms of their race, their religion, their colour, or their sex. So that was quite an interesting little look at equal opportunities policy. Through that, I became very heavily involved in the whole debate about whether it was appropriate for women to fly in the Air Force, particularly in combat aircraft. This was a very interesting debate that we were having at the time in the late 80s. The Air Force knew that it was facing a recruiting shortage because of the so-called demographic trough. There simply weren't enough young people coming out of university wanting a military career, and the RAF, the Royal Air Force, wasn't getting the sufficient number of really high calibre candidates. And yet, all the time, the answer was staring them in the face. The answer was, well, that's because you don't allow women to fly. If you did, you'd have twice as many people. The pool would be twice as big. But there were issues about whether it was appropriate for women to fly, particularly because of the blurred line sometimes between non-combat and combat zone, and almost the philosophical moral issue about the role of women in warfare. Now, I felt that the policy was discriminatory, and I said to my bosses, after having written several letters to very intelligent, determined young women who'd come out of university with excellent degrees, wanted to join the Air Force, and suddenly found that they couldn't do the one thing they really wanted to do. And I said, well, that's not really fair. My boss said, well, I don't think so either. He said, why don't you write a paper on it? So I wrote a paper, and it went up the chain of command. Fortunately, the Air Force senior personnel at the time were thinking along the same lines. So my paper went up at a very appropriate time. 2 years later, I got a phone call at home saying that the Secretary of State for Defence was going to announce in the House, Houses of Parliament, that the policy was going to change. Could I write the first draft of the Minister's speech? So that was a lovely example of where I'd started something, just really with a casual conversation with my boss, and where a year or two later, Secretary of State was on his feet announcing a major policy change. So moments like that, I think, were extremely interesting in my career.
Would you say that was the most significant in terms of change that you managed to create in society?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm claiming that I personally did that, because I think my paper went up at an opportune time. Had I not written my paper, maybe somebody else would have done, or maybe the senior people in the Air Force board would have made the decision anyway. So I'm not for a moment claiming that I changed the world, but perhaps I was pushing at the door when the door was ajar, so perhaps I helped open it. But I felt a degree of ownership of that policy, certainly, and I think it was quite flattering that still at a comparatively junior stage of my career, that I was asked to write the first draft of the speech. So that was a sort of acknowledgement, I suppose, of the role that I had had earlier on in the process.
So ultimately, why did you leave the MOD?
Well, that fast forwards over a lot of other things, but I felt there were a number of reasons. Firstly, because I had done the UFO job, and because I had become somebody who was known to the public and the media through my various television work, my books, etc., I felt that I had two parallel careers. I had my Ministry of Defence work, but I also had the work that I did as a freelance journalist, as a television presenter and commentator, as a PR consultant. There were two problems with that. Firstly, the relationship wasn't always easy. There were times when there were conflicts of interest. And the second point, just quite simply in terms of the workload, managing effectively two jobs, something had to give. There was one other point. I had just secured promotion to deputy director level, but I had, through the fact that my previous boss had been quite seriously ill, I had already done a job at deputy director level in an acting capacity. So I felt that I had got to a fairly senior level at the MOD, but I felt that I'd already done that job and knew what it was like. So I thought that might be an appropriate time for me to say, well, look, if I'm going to leave, now's a good time. Because if I take a substantive post at deputy director level, I'll feel that I've got to give the new section another 3 or 4 years. And again, I would be getting nearer and nearer to the stage where I was totally institutionalized. And, you know, I think there was a view that if I didn't leave now, I never would. And I would have still been there aged 60.
Right. And was there a specific time when you felt that that your work at the MOD was something that you would want to do forever?
Yes, and part of me still misses it. I'm one of these people that in my life I would rather, for example, be working for my country than working for a business. In other words, if I was working in